Holy Spirit.
Amen.
As you've just heard, our gospel story today is really two stories of two unnamed women, or of a woman and a young girl, 12 years old. And these people seemingly could not be more different. The girl is young, from a wealthy and powerful family, surrounded by people who are invested in what happens to her. And the woman is older, impoverished, and seemingly alone, surrounded by strangers in a crowd. I'm trying to figure out my preaching angle, my way into this story. I kept finding myself picturing a triptych, those altarpieces styled with 3 panels, 3 movements with God at the center. So I'd like to tell this story as I wish I could paint it, to break it down into these 3 constituent parts and to see what each part of this story has to tell us that might get too easily lost when we try to take it in as a whole. So in our first panel, let's say it's on the left, we see a man called Gyrus, or we think we can see Gyrus fighting his way through the crowd. Jesus has just stepped off a boat, the same boat he was aboard in last Sunday's gospel when he calmed a storm at sea. And the second Jesus and his disciples touch dry ground, they are plunged into a crowd that has gathered to see him, to hear him teach, hopefully to see a miracle. And Gyrus has fought his way through the crowd to fall at Jesus' feet and beg him to save his daughter's life. We're so used to Jesus healing people that we might miss something big right off the bat, which is that this moment, this request from Gyrus is deeply subversive. He's one of the leaders of the synagogue, and he holds religious and communal authority. And Jesus is some street preacher, mostly based in Capernaum these days because he was expelled from his hometown of Nazareth for preaching blasphemy in the synagogue there. It's as if our bishop went down into the subway to ask a homeless preacher if he could intervene in an issue in his life. That isn't to make fun, but to make it clear that we are seeing something almost unbelievable in this story. There's no frame of reference I can easily find. Gyrus is rich, Gyrus is powerful, and we can only assume that he has tried absolutely everything to save his little girl's life. And now he has come to Jesus, this street preacher, and falls on the ground in front of him. Prostrate in grief and submission, this powerful man is begging Jesus over and over to please do something. That's the first panel of our triptych, and already it's packed with action, with questions, and with surprises. And the question it raises for my own life and our life together is, are we talking about Jesus? Gyrus only comes to Jesus, it feels clear to me, because he has heard about this man, this indigent teacher and healer. He's heard that he could possibly save his baby girl. So I wonder, are we telling people about Jesus? Are we at least telling people about church, about worship, about what it does for us, the space it makes possible in our lives and in our hearts? Has anyone heard from us about the saving miracle of God's love for the world? On to the next panel. Let's go to the other end, the other side, as messengers come from Gyrus' house to say, it's too late, you've taken too long, your daughter is dead. And to this definitive, heart-rending news, Jesus says something nonsensical. He says, do not fear, only believe. Jesus and Gyrus and 3 of the disciples go to the house and find themselves in the midst of another crowd of family and friends and professional mourners, weeping and wailing. And again, Jesus says something unbelievable, telling the people that they shouldn't believe their own eyes, that this young girl has not died, and is merely sleeping. And the crowd, perhaps of course, laughs at him. Then Jesus does something surprising and perhaps counterintuitive. He sends all those scoffers away. The people who laughed, those who don't believe, those you think need it proved to them most, Jesus isn't there to win them over. He's there to help a grieving and shattered family. So he sends everyone else away. In relative privacy, Jesus raises this young girl back to life again and restores her to her family, to her life, and to her future. She will die again, the story implies, but at a more proper time, after a longer life, just like all of us one day fall asleep in the Lord. In this way, Mark gives us a foretaste of the resurrection, a glimpse of what is to come, both for Jesus and for us. So that's the second panel, the completion of this larger frame story. And this time I don't have a question as much as an observation, which is God comes at God's own pace. Jesus doesn't hurry, racing against time to get there before this girl dies. Again, I see the resurrection of Christ in this story, in the reminder that what looks like the end to us is never the end to God. I am reminded of something the dean told us in his sermon this past Sunday. He said, we have a lot to be afraid of in this world. We have a lot to be afraid of. But we never have to be afraid that Jesus doesn't care about us. Jesus may not arrive when and how this family had hoped, but God was never going to leave them alone in the midst of this grief. And that brings me in a roundabout way to the heart of our story, the central panel of this triptych, this nameless woman. She's often called the bleeding woman, or the modern variant, the hemorrhaging woman, or in the stained glass of our own medical bay, she is called more politely the crooked woman. All this rhetorical sleight of hand illustrates that we are no more comfortable with this woman and her ailment and our modern time than were the people of her ancient one. She is having an irregular period, irregular, heavy menstruation. And anyone who was raised having a period knows you are not supposed to talk about it. I wrote all this down and I felt more confident writing it down than saying it out loud. She's having a period. Despite this medical phenomenon belonging to fully half the population and being a key element in human reproduction, we are taught from an early age that period blood, it's shameful. And so this kind of bleeding and its attendant medical diagnoses, things like endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome that together affect well over 10% of all reproductive aged people who menstruate, multiple millions of people, are barely researched and take years to diagnose. That she suffered this way for 12 years is no more amazing now than it was then. And so it's no surprise, or should be no surprise, that this woman has been to every doctor that she could access, had endured much under many physicians, Mark says, without relief. And in a situation immediately recognizable to even millions more of Americans, this woman has a health crisis. And because of that, she is now impoverished. She has been bankrupted by her need for medical care. For those familiar with this story, you may have heard that the issue is actually ritual impurity, that according to Jewish law, women experiencing menstruation were barred from entering the temple and meant to stay apart from other people physically, lest their impurity pollute others and spread. And while that is true, it actually may not even matter here. Scholars of ancient Judaism in the New Testament have taught us that while this may have been an issue far to the south, in Jerusalem, near the temple and religious pilgrims, we have no evidence that this law mattered in this woman's local village, among her neighbors. So while the most common interpretation of this text for Christians is anti-Jewish legalism, Mark is very clear. This woman's problem is, first and foremost, the pain and discomfort of her physical ailment, and secondly, the fact that the medical care that she needs has bankrupted her. If the other two scenes of our story are triptych or crowded, the central image is a Tintoretto mob scene. The crowd is following Jesus as he tries to follow Gyrus, pressing in on them, this crushing profusion of people with their curiosity, their questions, and their needs. And just like Gyrus, this bleeding woman has heard about Jesus and his power, and she decides she doesn't need to speak to him or even reveal herself. If she can just touch the hem of his garment, she will be healed. So she does. Immediately, her bleeding stops. Immediately, she knows she is healed. Her long nightmare is over. And at the same time, Jesus feels power flow out of him. That's how it's described. Jesus feels power flow out of him. All at once, his experience mirrors hers, because what is bleeding if not power flowing out of you? Without even needing to exchange a word, this woman is healed through God's fundamental mutuality, his companionship. This is God for us, fully human as he is fully divine, fully loving, desiring us, and feeling what we feel, even to menstruate. If the raising of Gyrus' daughter prefigures Christ's resurrection, this moment reveals Christ's passion. There is bleeding, suffering, affliction, and the pouring out of the self. If that was all there was to this story, it would be enough. But it wasn't enough for God. I imagine that this woman reached out to touch Jesus because she was not sure that he could see her. She seemed to understand that God would heal her. So Jesus stops. Gyrus, an important, powerful man in a crisis, Jesus is turning around as the massive of people. Who touched me? No one watching can understand him. None of this makes any sense, but it does to this faithful woman. And so Jesus makes the invisible visible. He makes the implicit explicit, and this woman is not only but empowered to tell her story, to have the full experience of a relationship with God. To risk going on too long on a hot morning, there are two last things I want to say about this story, and especially their physical, bodily struggles. I look around our country right now and I see an unwillingness to engage with the fullness of people's bodily experiences. This is especially true when it comes to the experience of trans and non-binary people and the experience of women who need abortions. I do not mean to irresponsibly stick a toe into a massive controversial pool here, but so much of the social, cultural, and legal debate I hear is about the idea of trans people, the idea of trans children, about the idea of when and how people might seek an abortion, about the idea of them and the hypothetical narratives that make them degenerates or heroes, without ever listening to them as complex human beings. I implore you, if you have not yet, to seek out people's stories in their own words. The hemorrhaging woman told Jesus, quote, "the whole truth," Mark tells us. If only we knew what her story truly was. In our own day, Our modern debates about purity and impurity, we can know if we take the time to listen. I'm not here to offer political opinions. I would just like to lift up that the issues that face us, that face our nation, we're not talking about moral abstractions. In all these challenges, to consider legal policies' concrete and material effects on human beings is a deeply Christian act, because we have an incarnate faith. We worship a God who has made us, heals us, and holds us, no matter who we are and no matter what we have done. I know I am a Christian in part because of the concrete and material nature of our faith. Bread and wine, flesh and blood, the daily and specific hard work of love. I will end with this one last thing from this inexhaustible font of a story of Jesus. I hope you'll read it again for yourself today. I want to acknowledge that there is something haunting about healing stories. There's something painful for anyone who is seeking healing for themselves or for someone they love, or mourning a cure for someone for whom the cure never came. While I stand here preaching about God's love for us, that God will never leave us alone, that God longs to be in relationship with us, I cannot hope to ring true without acknowledging that healing doesn't always look like a total restoration of life. When we contend with that, when we dare to face it, we can see where and how God is actually showing up for the sick and the dying and those who mourn. And again, this looks like listening and reaching out to the people in your own lives who are sick or who are mourning someone who has died. We tend to hold ourselves apart and worry about saying the right thing. It is death. I read a reflection this week from a man dying of Parkinson's who told his pastor, "I have been healed, not from Parkinson's disease, but I have been healed from my fear of Parkinson's disease." He was healed through the deep companionship of Jesus Christ, healed by a God who is not afraid to draw near to his frail and mortal body or to come close to the people who were crying and mourning for him as he approached the end of his life. This man dying from Parkinson's, this woman who had been sick and hemorrhaging for 12 years, this father of a dying daughter, they dare to draw near to Jesus and to tell the whole truth. They all take a situation that looks hopeless and dares to believe there may yet be hope. I pray we all have the courage to join them.